starting in the 1920s all the way up to like the early 2000s. My mentor was Milo Alvarez. He's an associate professor of history at Bard College of Science around in Massachusetts. So just a quick overview before we get into it. I'll give a brief introduction of Black feminism, some of my methods that I've used. Then I'll be looking at 3 generations of Black feminist theory and activism, and then we'll talk about some directions for future research and maybe some of the limitations, and then there'll be a brief Q&A session. So much of the scholarship on Black feminism really centers around the 1960s and 70s. So it either talks about Black women's involvement in the second wave feminist movement, or kind of this attempt by Black women to create a space for themselves separate from either the women's liberation or Black liberation movements. So really, some of the need for a Black feminism is this idea that women's issues are not all the same. It's that we have intersecting identities and systems of oppression that produce distinct experiences and issues for women of color, particularly Black women. So that's really where this whole idea of Black feminism comes out of. But most of the scholarship only focuses on the 60s and 70s and doesn't look at that there's a much larger kind of longer timeline. So essentially what I'll be doing is I'm tracing an intellectual history of Black feminisms across several generations, starting in the 20s into the early 2000s, and hopefully that will kind of get us to have a deeper understanding of these various systems of oppression that are experienced by Black women. So just to go over my methods, so there's this construct called the long civil rights movement construct, and essentially what it does is we generally talk about the civil rights movement being from about 1954 to 68. And what this construct does is it kind of decentralizes it and pushes the timeline backwards all the way up into the late 19th century. So I'm applying the same construct to Black feminism. And so instead of this idea of waves of Black feminism, I'm kind of asserting this continuous timeline, starting with what we call Black radical women in the Communist Party, all the way up to hip-hop feminists starting in the 1980s all the way up to the early 2000s. While acknowledging the complexities between each generation, I'll argue that hip-hop feminism is ideologically, methodologically, and spiritually rooted in the much earlier Black feminist struggles starting in the early 20th century. So these are just a couple of reminders. There's some limitations to calling some of these women feminists. In the early kind of 1920s, it's a little anachronistic because there isn't an actual feminist movement, a Black feminist movement during this time. And also some of them will kind of reject the term feminism because they feel like that there isn't really a space for them. That feminism at this time is really this kind of white feminist, this upper middle class white feminist space, right? So they don't really feel like there's a space for them. But I'm using the term feminist here because much of their work in activism is consistent with what we would generally think of as Black feminism. So this is not a comprehensive examination of Black feminism, but I'm focusing primarily on particular people and subjects in each generation, generally probably not talked about in the discourse in order to produce probably the best analysis. And just a quick reminder, of course, none of these groups are monolithic. All experience kind of overlaps with their mainstream contemporaries and other feminist ideologies. So this first generation, like I said, starts in like the 20s, and essentially comes out of this work. It's this recent wave of work looking at Black women in the old left, right? So prior to the 1950s. So most of this work is coming from Eric S. McDuffie, and it's this idea that you have these Black women who were either previously in the Garvey movement or what we call club organizations, and a lot of those movements were looking specifically just at Black nationalism. They neglected any type of class consciousness or feminist consciousness. So many of these women, they were organizers and activists and journalists in Harlem, and so they kind of defected from these Garvey movements and transitioned into the Communist Party USA. So at around the same time, you have this high Pan-Africanism in these club organizations, and the club organizations is where you have a lot of women who were part of the Garvey movement, but they were on the ground in these grassroots organizations, and they weren't necessarily these really visible leaders. So what you have with these Black left feminists is they're breaking away from that, and they're introducing a class consciousness, they're they're rejecting kind of these respectability politics attached to Black women's sexuality. And so this other idea of intersectionality that I kind of talked about earlier, this idea that people's identities intersect, systems of oppression kind of are all interconnected to, and to kind of conspire with each other, that you can't really talk about race without talking about gender, without talking about class, right? So that idea we generally credit to the 60s and the 70s, Angela Davis or Kimberly Crenshaw or Jill Collins, but really that comes earlier when it's actually a term called triple oppression that they use during this period. So the next is probably what we're more familiar with, which is what we call mainstream Black feminism. And so it kind of arose out of this lack of space for Black women, either the second wave or civil rights and Black power movements. For most of the civil rights and Black power movements, it kind of positioned Black women's experiences as secondary to the larger struggle. So once we get these basic human rights for Black people, then we can talk about specifically what's going on with Black women. And like I talked about earlier with intersectionality, a lot of people recognize that doesn't really work, right? That when we only focus on race or we only focus on gender, certain people's issues kind of get lost and certain people become invisible. And in this sense, Black women were kind of invisible during this period. So later in about the 70s and the 80s, you have Black feminist theorists like Angela Davis, Kimberly Crenshaw, Alice Walker, Bell Hooks, and Jill Collins. And the thing is that most of them don't actually come until the 80s, but we stopped the scholarship in the 1970s. So what that says is that it kind of says that Black women's involvement stopped after the second wave feminist movement. So it's like Black women stopped being, engaged after they got their, basic human rights with like second wave feminism. But that totally disregards a lot of this work after the 80s. So what I'm doing is I'm pushing the scholarship forward, and I'm looking at this new generation called hip-hop feminists in the 1980s. So there's a little bit of debate on who this actually centers around. I guess this would kind of be my generation, but the dates are really about 1964 to 1985-ish, and some people try to extend that further, maybe into like the 2000s. But the point is that most of these people in this what we call the hip-hop generation, they're the first to experience kind of this post-segregation era, right? So they're no longer getting their values and their worldviews from like traditional institutions like the family or the church. Instead, they're getting most of their values from the media, hip-hop, and their peers. So essentially what that does is that produces these new conditions, these new experiences for these women, and so they kind of feel like that this feminism that the Black feminism in the earlier generations didn't really give them, it didn't really equip them with the tools and the analysis to really interpret their own issues, right? So what hip-hop feminism does, it kind of tries to get out of this victim-oppressor model of feminism, and instead kind of asserts a more women-centered worldview. It expands beyond these criticisms of misogyny and sexism in hip-hop, and instead says that, when we talk about like what we call video hoes, right? We always say that they're like objectifying themselves, right? By being in these videos that they're putting on, they're in like these two pieces, and these men are like swiping credit cards down their butts, and that's like them objectifying themselves. Well, what this says is that actually this may be that those women have, but that analysis denies those women some type of sexual agency, right? Is that this feminism tries to give agency back to women and saying that women who participate in hip-hop actually may be trying to go towards like this own kind of sexual liberation, right? And what's interesting is, I'll talk about this a little bit later, but we actually see this a lot in the 1920s, in this kind of earlier Black-led feminism I was talking about. And so essentially what hip-hop feminism is about is it's trying to reconcile wanting to participate in hip-hop while still understanding there are a lot of issues in terms of gender politics. So it's trying to kind of navigate that space. So who coins it is Joan Morgan. She's this journalist, and what she essentially says is the hip-hop feminist generation is kind of the daughters of feminist privilege, right? They're no longer really dealing with these issues of invisibility and reparations that these earlier generations are, and they have whole new issues that they have to deal with. And what's interesting about it is it actually didn't start out as this really academic kind of thing, just like in the earlier, that first earliest generation. It's not academic, they're on the ground, they're either writing or, yeah. So just to kind of explore some of those connections. So that generation in the 60s and 70s, most of them are scholars. They're in the academy, they're theorizing about Black feminism. But that early generation in these women in hip hop, they kind of employ what we call more of like a folk tradition, right? These women in hip hop, they're writing personal narratives to kind of explain some of their issues. So it's not really, like I said, it didn't really start out as something very academic. So in that sense, we see that at both ends of the timeline. We also see that in the first generation that you have, they're more interested in grassroots activism. Like I said, they're on the streets of Harlem. They're trying to get together, like they're fighting against like community evictions, like grocery store policies, all these things, right? And then the other thing that we see that is similar in both the hip hop generation and the Black left feminism generation is this ideas on sexual politics, right? Is in this early generation you have these blues women who are very similar to hip hop women in hip hop, and these Black left feminists are kind of rejecting this idea that's espoused by club women that says that there's, they're trying to resist these images of Black women as hypersexual. So their idea is to be really conservative and have this proper etiquette. Well, those Black left feminists are saying, no, we're going to have like this sexual modernist kind of view. And it's the same thing we see with these hip hop feminists much later. So my directions for further research, I want to look at what we call this kind of post-hip hop generation or feminism. Like I said, the dates for hip hop feminism aren't very rigid, so some people even say that I'm probably more in the post-hip hop generation, and there's some kind of work being done there. So I would love to expand the scholarship that way. And also do a comparison of kind of the blues women in the early 20th century to women in hip hop. Thank you. If you want to look at any of the research, those are just a few names.